run a few programs with the gardens. I lead the One Vegetable, One Community program, so it's focused around the vegetable of the year. This year's vegetable of the year is collard greens. So I'll be starting a bunch of different varieties of collard greens, and I would invite you to join me. If you didn't bring any containers with you, I have some for you to use. The co-op has donated soil that you can use to start your seeds. So there'll be a hands-on component to this class, which I'm excited about because no one wants to just listen to someone talk for an hour. We'll get to touch some dirt. YouTubers will not get to touch dirt, but maybe they can follow along and plant seeds as we go through the class. So to give you a little bit more information about collard greens, since it's a large part of what I do, collard greens are in the brassica family. They can withstand a frost. Not only can they withstand a frost, they get sweeter after a frost. So if you wait to harvest and eat them after a frost, they'll be a little bit less bitter. And why that is the antifreeze in the plant is actually sugar. So when the cells are trying to protect themselves during cold weather, they produce an antifreeze, and it makes them a little bit sweeter. They're domesticated in the same area as with like the rest of the cole crops in the brassica family. So when I say that, it's the cabbage family. So like cabbage, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, kale, are all super similar, same species actually, descendant from wild mustard. And another cool part about this program is that I, along with Farm to School and a few other organizations, go into all the classrooms all the second grade classrooms in Duluth and teach a vegetable of the year lesson to them. There's parts of the plant standard that second graders need to fulfill, so we get to go in and basically do what we're doing tonight with all the second graders. And we're also partnering this year with Health Equity Northland, which is an African heritage organization, and we're doing a cultural component to the lesson as well, which I'm really excited about. So that's collards. If you didn't bring seeds or containers or anything, you're still welcome to use that tonight. I really encourage you to. I see some of you guys did bring your own containers. That's awesome. I want to know what brought you in. Are you a beginning gardener? Let's say raise your hand if you have 0 to 1 years of gardening experience. Okay. Sometimes I get people who maybe even are more experienced than me in these classes. So let's keep going. What about up to 2 to 3 years gardening experience? Okay. 3 to 4, all right. More than 5 years of gardening experience. Okay, so we've got about half of you guys 0 to 1 years. Have you ever attempted to start your own seeds? Raise your hand. So you've attempted. Keep your hand raised if they failed miserably. Okay, what do you think went wrong? What about successful seed starting before? Maybe, yeah, what'd you grow?
Peppers.
Peppers?
Different hot peppers.
Okay, did you grow them in a window or with lights?
I did one of these seed starting tray things.
Okay.
At Home Depot or something.
Nice, what's that top piece there?
I don't remember.
Okay.
I think it's to sit in the water or something.
Oh, okay. To keep them up out of the water maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, I haven't seen that method before. Let's see, let's get you guys some handouts. That's okay. So one of the first things, let me get your burning questions at the start so I make sure that I answer them. So why don't you raise your hand and tell me what your most burning question is that brought you into class tonight? Yeah. Fertilizers?
Thinning.
Okay, thinning. Those are both, I'll make sure to touch on those then. So let's start with the basics. Seed selection. Where are your seeds coming from? I've known and failed myself because I ordered some cool seeds off the internet, and I didn't know the organization that they were coming from. I didn't know if the strain would be pure. This was in particular this tomato. I was seeking the Northern Delight tomato, and it's supposed to be good for northern climates. It grows small. It's like an heirloom variety, and every year they sent it to me. I'd grow it out. I'd water it all summer long, and then in August they would be like these 5-pound yellow tomatoes, and they were supposed to be like 1-inch round red tomatoes, and the squirrels would eat them, and I grew them and it was fine, but they were not what I was expecting every year. And I even emailed this person year after year pictures of the tomatoes, and he keeps sending me more seeds, and they kept being the wrong tomatoes. So you need to have a trustworthy source of seeds. I really like Johnny's. I basically exclusively order from Johnny's seeds, but we also get a lot of donated seeds through High Mowing Organic, and I think that's maybe what the co-op sells.
We have High Mowing in North Circle.
Okay, yep, those, oh yeah, North Circle's great. So you want to make sure that you basically have a trustworthy seed source. The next thing you want to look at is how old the seeds are. So if you're getting it from the co-op, they only sell seeds that are packaged for the current season. So you're pretty low risk purchasing them. If you're getting them from a friend or donated, like from the Duluth Community Garden Program, you want to look and see what year they were packaged for. So like these ones were from 2020, and I don't have a hard and fast rule about how quickly the germination rates decline. But for me personally, if it's older than like 4 or 5 years, they're kind of trash. Like I might throw them in the ground and see what happens. But seeds really need to be grown out and then resaved in order to keep their vitality and keep them germinating. So make sure you're not starting with a trustworthy source. They're not too old. And then if they're a really great company, like Johnny's, they'll actually put the germination rate, so they do germination tests on their seeds, and they'll put the germination rate on the packet. So if I'm using jargon, you can always raise your hand and stop me, but germination rate is basically if you planted 100 of these seeds, how many would germinate? This one's 99%. So 99% of the seeds, 99 seeds would germinate. Sometimes they'll say like 70%, and I'll take that into account when I'm doing my seeding, and I'll maybe plant like a third more seeds than I normally would to account for that lower germination rate. Then you want to think about when is our last date of frost where we live, which is usually around like Memorial Day, like May 31st, and then count backwards. So most seeds appreciate like a 4 to 6 week window. So if you count backwards from May 31st, 4 weeks would bring us to April 30th, and then 2 weeks from there would be like mid-April would be an ideal time to start seeds. So we're a little bit early, we're like a week early. And because of that, you want to think about what are some seeds maybe, since I'm starting early, that could potentially go out early, meaning can they tolerate a frost? So that's why I chose to do a bunch of collards today. So these will grow out for 6 weeks. They'll be ready a week before the estimated last frost date. And then, am I getting too heady? Okay. They'll go out like last week of May. They might have a frost, but they'll survive, and then they can keep going. I think you have to be careful about starting seeds too early. It's really kind of precarious to start your seeds when you're getting excited about spring, especially planting things like tomatoes or squash too early. They'll get sickly before you can even get them outside if you start them too early. So sometimes it's better to just wait than to be a little bit on the later end than to be on the early end. So I would steer everyone in class here today away from things like corn or squash or tomatoes, and stick with stuff like onions, chives, anything in the cabbage family, maybe spinach. Lettuce might be too early because lettuce only takes like 50 days to harvest, so then you're almost already to harvest by the time that you would be transplanting, so it doesn't make sense to start lettuce from seed early, in my opinion. And that's the other thing to look at when you look at seeds. So I'm going to give you guys a break in a little bit to go peruse all the seeds and challenge you to find what you would want to plant. But I want you to find the days to maturity, which basically it's listed on almost all seed packets. This one on this kale says 40 days from transplant. This bok choy says 50 days, and then that's usually means from transplant, that days to maturity. So it doesn't include the 6 weeks that it's spent growing in the container. And basically, why it's always a good habit to look at that number is because some things like Brussels sprouts have about 120 days to maturity, and in our growing season, we like barely even have 120 days. So you might just be out of luck. Like we might run out of time before you get a harvest. I've run into that with winter squash a lot of times. It takes so long at the end of the season to like cure it and get that hard shell that it can be stored in that it isn't even worth it to plant it sometimes in Duluth. And so we're trying to get around that, right? That's like why we're here. We're trying to extend our season and get around our short growing season. I also want you to take into account if you have any vacations planned, because if you start seeds and then leave, like they'll die. I've left them with dog sitters who've done an okay job and kept them alive, but you can't expect to leave your plants and have them be healthy when you come back. So treat them like a pet once they're planted. Once they start that process of germination, as soon as they uptake water, or imbibe it's called, then the process is started and you're locked in. So why don't you, I'll stand up and you can take a look at the collared seeds up here, and then there's a bunch of seeds back there, and I want you to pick at least one packet of what you might want to seed today, based off everything I just told you. Put you to the test. Okay, so let's talk containers. That's your next decision that you have to make. My favorite way to start seeds, because I work for the garden program and because I have a history of owning a farm, I cannot grow anything less than this. I like giving away plants too. I like having surplus. This is what you'd call like a 72 in a greenhouse because it's 6 by 12. So there's 72 cells in here. I like this size. I find that in 4 to 6 weeks, the roots get really nice and tight in there, and the plugs come out easily. If you start seeds, they're going to be totally fine if you do. You can actually keep them in here longer than 4 weeks if you use this size, and it might even be better. So if you did want to start like a tomato or a pepper or something today, you could use this size and then just keep it inside longer until the roots basically reached and filled this entire pot. So thinking about when you remove the pot, it should come out easily. So that's why I like this size. There's also peat pots. These were a failure. We gave these to second graders maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and the classrooms could not keep them alive. Like, it's already hard to keep seedlings alive, and these dried out so quickly, and they're so small, so they don't have that like holding capacity that other containers have. Virtually impossible. I tried to start some of my own seeds in here, and I basically had to keep them in a dish of water and regularly water them at least like once or twice a day to soak the entire peat pot. So if you're going peat, I'd recommend something that holds more soil and therefore more moisture and dries out less quickly. You're welcome to try out some of these. These might also be a good size for tomatoes or peppers if you wanted to try those today. And then there's also sometimes a method where if you want to sow your seeds like in an open flat like this, and essentially treat this as a germination tray. Once the seeds reach the first true leaf stage, you can separate them all out and then upplant them into something larger like this, and then finish them in this container. So there's some seeds that really like having that done, and some seeds that absolutely hate it. Tomatoes really love being upplanted. If they could be upplanted multiple times, they would be very, very happy. They like moving like a hermit shell up and up and up and up. And every time you transplant a tomato, you can bury up to 1/3 of the plant. And you know all those white hairs along the tomato stalk, those all become roots if you bury them. So they actually just get a really great root ball going if you transplant them. Plants that hate having their roots touched, that I actually just don't bother starting from seed inside anymore, is squash plants, anything in the squash family. Things like zucchini, winter squash, cucumbers, they just have really bad shock if you fondle their roots too much. I might try them this year since they are a heat-loving crop and they don't germinate well in cool soil, cool, wet soil. I might try them in a peat pot this year. And why that's good is you could kind of like rip off the bottom, score the edges so that the roots can get out the side, and then plant it. So I'll give that a try. That's what I'd recommend if you wanted to start a squash plant, or touching it as little as possible, putting it in something like this, just drop it out and just plop it in without like touching it, minimize any touching that you do, definitely not upplanting it over and over and over again. There's also an option with your bottom tray. So I like to use bottom trays. It keeps things nice and neat. If you're looking for drainage, they have ones with holes. So if you know that the types of crops that you're planting don't like having their roots wet all the time, you could do one with drainage. If you're worried about maybe ruining your windowsill or ruining your table or something, you could use one without holes. You just have to be careful about keeping it too wet or having standing water down there unless they're mature enough that they can bottom water. So if this is too much jargon, always just raise your hand. Bottom watering is where mature plants that have reached the bottom of their pots with their roots are able to suck up standing water in the bottom with their roots. So rather than top watering, like tomatoes don't like having their leaves wet, you just water the tray and then they suck up their water from the bottom. But it only works if they're old enough to have the roots reaching all the way to the bottom, if that makes sense. Otherwise, you might get mold problems with no drainage in there. So why don't you guys, based off what I said, pick your container out. It's also important to label what you are planting. So grab some masking tape if your pot doesn't have tape on it already, and label what you're going to plant. Select your container. Are there any questions? I threw a lot of information at you about containers.
This is gonna be okay.
Yeah, that'll be fine. You'll just have to be careful about moisture, and we'll talk about moisture in a minute.
So.
Yeah, those will work. Those are just like the germination flats. Yeah, so.
So spinach?
Yep, you could do.
Like a, I don't know.
Just do them at a spacing that you could pull them apart. So you could mimic the spacing on this if you wanted to.
Okay.
And then when they're ready to be either planted out, probably planted outside spinach because you plant right away. You just don't want them so close that their roots become intertwined and that when you try and separate them, it damages them too much. So it's one of the benefits of having these, their roots stay separate so you aren't having to pull them apart, but something like spinach wouldn't mind too much to have their roots pulled. But like squash, for example, you wouldn't want to put squash together and have to rip their roots apart. Yeah.
Basil?
Basil, same thing. Yeah, you could just sprinkle that all in there, and those are pretty resilient. Yeah. Are there any other questions about containers? Okay, so number one, when you're filling your containers, you always want to start with pre-moistened soil. If you're trying to water to get the soil wet after you've planted the seeds, they can become flooded. They can like spray out of the tray if you're doing it like with a hose or with a watering can from above, they can splash out. And it might not reach to the bottom. Like it looks like it's wet, but you've really only watered the first ½ inch and then it dries out and then you're screwed. So you want to start with pre-moistened soil. Most soil that you start with isn't moist enough. Part of that's shipping. A lot of companies will purposefully dry out the soil so that it costs less to ship it, which makes sense. Uses less fossil fuels. So you're almost always going to have to add water. This is from the co-op. They sell this. It's organic potting soil. And I have 2 bags of it in here. This is what we'll be using to start our seeds. And I'm going to feel it with my hands. This is kind of like, I don't know if you guys want to touch this. We should get some kitchen mirrors. Just go a little bit at a time. Mix it around. And it starts to kind of get crumbly and clumpy. So you don't want standing water in it. But you also want to be able to stick your hand in and say, oh yeah, if I was a baby seed, that'd be enough water for me. So some of this is, I apologize, a lot of what I do is intuitive. So if my processes don't make sense, I will try to the best of my ability to describe them in a more scientific way. But maybe a way to describe it is when you squeeze it, is there water coming out? There's a little water coming out. So we're actually, for this clump, we're there. You want to be able to squeeze it and have it hold together, but not dripping water. So once I fully mix all of this, we should be at the right consistency, and then I'll come back around and I'll let you feel what the end goal is. It's usually easier to mix your soil in a vessel that's bigger, can accommodate. Choose a big mixing bin. Is what I'm trying to say. You don't want to be trying to do this in like a little kitchen mixing bowl. Choose a Rubbermaid or like a 10-gallon bucket. That's looking good. So it's kind of, you can see now that there's some clumps just naturally. It holds. It's not dripping though when I squeeze it, but it holds together. If you want to stick your hand in, you can. You can also wait till you fill your container. I'd say I added, I don't know, like a liter or 2. Yeah. So you're giving them a really great start on water, on moisture. So then as you load your container, oh, I should say, if you're using a used container, you want to make sure that it's sanitized. There's a disease in Duluth that's pretty new called clubroot, which affects everything in the cole crop family or the cabbage family. And just besides that, there's different diseases and fungi that affect plants. So you want to do a peroxide or bleach solution. First you get out all the big bits of like dirt, because if you sanitize and there's still bits of things, it doesn't actually sanitize, as we learned with like COVID, and sanitizing dirty hands doesn't really sanitize. So you have to get all the big bits out, sanitize it, let it dry completely, and then you're ready to go. So you can keep reusing these containers. Andre said that he's been using these ones for 3 years and it looks like they were freshly washed. Yeah. So if you get something like this that can stand up to the test of time, you can keep reusing them and sanitizing them over and over again instead of using single-use plastic, which is great. So getting like a Rubbermaid bin like this, if you're concerned about spreading disease or just want to clean your tools after a season, you can always do a bleach solution in a tub like this and dump all your tools in there. Or all your little cups and things from year to year. So yeah, if you're using a used tray, you want to sanitize it. This one's brand new, so I don't have to do that. All right, as you fill your container, oops, don't worry about soil. Andre has assured me that it's fine if we get the classroom dirty. I could have brought a tarp. Basically, I do like 3 rounds. I should show. Not everyone has the same container, but it's nice to use gloves when I use this type of tray, because you can see I'm kind of like smearing the soil over the top, and sometimes there's sticks and you can get slivers or your hands get really roughed up. But for the soil mixing process, it's nice to do it without gloves so you can really get a good sense for what your moisture levels are at. Okay. So you've lightly loaded. I haven't packed these down at all yet. What I do next is I kind of like do 3 fingers and I just go like this. And you can see, I don't know if you can see, but it compacts it almost 50% of the way down. So that looks pretty good. Then I go again. Just lightly sprinkling it all over. You don't want to over compact it, but you do want, once the roots start going, to have good contact with the soil. So it kind of has to be this perfect balance. All right. So people with normal cups, you'd probably fill it maybe 1/3, lightly pack it, another 1/3, lightly pack, and then do that last 1/3. For this one, I'm now just putting slight finger indentations in the tops Most brassicas need 1/4 of an inch planting depth, so just a slight finger depression is all you need. Generally, the planting depth of the seed is the width and or length or girth or whatever you want to call it of the seed itself. So if you're planting a squash seed, it's like 1/2 inch. Basically, the bigger the seed, the deeper it goes. But I want to warn you that planting seeds too deeply is one of the biggest inhibitors to germination. So if they have too much soil on top of them, they can't sense the light, they can't push through, they give up basically. Like they're, especially the smaller seeds that don't have the energy stored in them to get through will just give up. So err on the side of too little soil covering versus being worried that you're planting them too deep, I guess. Seeds more important than if you're just repotting a houseplant, because if there is big chunks of sticks or something else like that and it's laying right across where your seed is trying to push up, then it could stop it from germinating. So I usually get a germination specific potting mix. It looks like a great potting mix. It doesn't have big pieces of wood in it or rocks. Something to remember too about if there is undecomposed wood in your soil or in your potting mix, that's actually pulling nitrogen out of the soil to complete its decomposition process. So it's pulling nitrogen away from your plants to undergo that process. So you don't generally want to use wood chips as, like fresh wood chips as mulch in your garden for that reason. I'm wondering if we can fit everyone around this, if you guys want to watch before you plant your seeds, to come up here. Do you guys in the back want to come up? So I just wanted to bring you guys up. If you didn't see when you came up to fill your trays, this slight depression is usually about 1/4 of an inch. I do 2 seeds per hole. If the germination rate's low or if they're very old seeds, I'll do more than that. These are 99% germination, but they're 5 years old. So I'm kind of doing 2 or 3 in here. And then I wanted to show you how I cover them. So I actually I used to sprinkle soil back over the top, but I've had more luck just flicking soil back over. So I kind of like flick and then I pat, tap, tap, flick, tap, tap, flick, tap, tap, tap. That's all I do. And I find that if I sprinkle soil over the top, sometimes the seeds can get disturbed or lost and it's kind of uneven, or it's just too much soil. You just end up putting way too much soil in. So that's what I would recommend for your planting. And do you have any questions while you're standing up here? Yeah.
You said they were 5 years old. How old is too old?
You can do a germination test. I usually don't, because I just don't think of it by the time that I'm ready to plant, but it involves like putting them in a wet paper towel in a baggie, and then you like check to see how many germinated, and it also is like a little bit wasteful in my opinion, because then the seeds don't get planted. You just count them and you're like, oh, that's how many will germinate. But I've planted these every year for the last 5 years and they've grown fine, so I have no reason to believe that they would have poor germination, basically. But they are getting there. I should probably plant them out mostly. And part of this too, I'm learning through indigenous perspectives of the land, is that we have a responsibility to the seeds to plant them. and to plant them, and to learn how to save them and caretake them basically. So we're responsible for these seeds continuing. We've entered into a relationship with these plants that we have to uphold because they can't exist without us anymore. So thinking about how can I not waste these seeds now that they're here and I've purchased them? Should I give them to friends? Should I plant them all out and share the food with friends so that they don't end up in the dumpster, essentially? So I like to keep that in mind too when I'm accepting seeds as a gift or giving them away. It's entering into this relationship with these plants. So any other questions? Oh, okay, plant your seeds.
What about some people start their seeds like in water?
Oh.
Is that a good thing to do?
Yeah, we were kind of talking about that, like soaking them ahead of time.
Oh, like with the paper towel?
These one, like, I've done it with peas before, where you soak them in water, but you have to be careful about soaking seeds because they need oxygen just like everything else.
Yeah.
And they'll basically drown
Okay.
if you do it for more than 24 hours.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if my seed packet says to plant 7 to 10 seeds in a cluster,
Oh, is that chives?
yeah.
Yeah, I'm doing chives too. Mm-hmm.
So should I do?
Yeah, do
that
like
or
a-
do 1 or 2.
No, do what it says.
Okay.
When in doubt. So yeah, you all saw that I planted 2 seeds per cell, and why I do that is because I just don't want empty real estate. And I know I talked big game about not wasting seeds like 1 minute ago, but you don't want wasted real estate over here. So what you'll do is you'll wait until they germinate, and then once you see the cotyledons, so that's fancy talk for the very first 2 leaves that come up, is the cotyledons, and you don't pull them. You take a scissors, very small, sharp scissors, and right at the base of the plant, you select the smaller or weaker looking one, you just snip it. If you have a lot, like I do, you could even eat them like microgreens if you wanted to, and that way they don't go to waste. But you don't want to rip the plant because that will disturb the roots to the remaining plant that's in there. So you snip, take a nice small sharp scissors right after germination. So you don't want to let them get too big because then they're already competing for resources and their roots are intertwined. So kind of at a young age, you'll go through and you'll thin all of your plants. So if you have just 1 pot, sometimes it's nice to plant them a little bit, I don't know if I should have mentioned this before you guys planted, a little bit offset so that if they do grow right next to each other, it's a little bit easier to trim one off. So that was your question about thinning. What was you asked about the pot.
Would you not want to put very much in there then, since you just essentially want to do 1?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And you would also, in addition to pulling off the bottom, you'd want to score the sides too, so that the roots could go out laterally and not just down. Yeah. Yep. So there's some varieties that I don't bother starting from seed, and that's because they, like, let's say their days to maturity are just 30 days. Like, maybe it's salad greens that you're eating, you're cutting like haircut style, and you're just eating as loose cut greens. I wouldn't start them in a tray and then put them outside and then haircut them. I would direct sow them, and then once they're at their baby leaf stage, I would cut them right from the soil. So when you're thinking about which plants you want to start from seed early, it's usually those plants with the longer days to maturity, so they need a lot of time, and it's the heat-loving crops, the ones that you can't put out before when there's still danger of frost. So heat-loving crops are like okra, corn, tomatoes, melons, they need that jump start, and that's a factor of days to maturity too, because they also take longer. Things that I always direct seed are carrots, beets, lettuces, and mainly like root crops. They're just easier to thin them once they've been seeded in the ground, and they can germinate in soil that is cooler temperatures. So if you think of like spring crops, those are usually seeds that can tolerate sitting in like cool, wet soil without rotting. If there's any seeds that are so finicky that they can't do that, we have to baby them and do this. But that brings me to the discussion about heat. Let's talk first. I think where most people run into trouble, I never introduced myself really, or like gave my qualifications for teaching this course. So I worked at a variety of farms across the United States for a program called WOOF, which is Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms, and did like high desert growing in New Mexico, and looked after like heritage hogs in Oregon. And I also ran my own market garden farm in Iowa for several years. And for the past 3 years, have worked for the Duluth Community Garden Program as their education and outreach coordinator, and have also gotten my master's in environmental education with a focus in gardening with children. So I'm in classrooms a lot, planting with students. I also work for a foundation in Madison where I give grants to schools to start pollinator gardens. So I'm troubleshooting with teachers. Right now I have 22 teachers in 6 different states that I'm working with to start their pollinator gardens. And they come to me with all their issues and troubles and germinating and starting these pollinator plants. And the most common problem that I hear back from them is issues figuring out the moisture requirements for their plants. So this is something that, like I said before, when you're planning your vacations in the springtime, to really take your seeds into account, or just wait till you're back to start them, because once they imbibe water, you're locked in to that process. They've started the germination process. And when I say the word germinate, it's basically once that seed has broke the surface of the soil. So there's stuff going on probably beneath the soil that we can't see, like they're sending down their roots first. Usually that's how seeds do it, is they imbibe water, they send their root down, and then they send their shoot up, and then there's the cotyledons. Grasses just have 1 cotyledon. Most vegetable plants have 2. Alliums, it's just that 1. And they need constant moisture until they germinate. So if you don't see green, the tray needs to be moist. And that's sort of the key. It can be tricky to remember, so maybe I should come up with a rhyme or something like no green, not seeing water all the time. I don't know what that would be. But basically, you want it to stay moist. Once they pop, you want to allow for periods of dry down. So a lot of teachers also get mold, have mold issues, or damping off, it's called, where if you've ever had a plant just like looks like it got cut at the base and it just falls over, it looks like something pinched it at the base and it's just dead. That's a fungus, that's a fungal issue, that's a disease from overwatering. So when you see the green, you can start to allow for periods of dry down. And it's hard to describe, and the best that I can do is also just going back to this idea of like really tune into your observation skills. So if the plant looks like it's stressed or struggling and needs water, water it. If it looks and feels like it's receiving too much water, let it dry out. What you can help, there's so many things that you can do to help you along so that it's less pressure on you to decide what the plant needs, and that involves like placement and light and heat, and where there's like so many things going on, right? It's like this giant puzzle, a giant problem solving thing. So I'm gonna give you some tips of like horror stories of things that have gone wrong that I know for sure that you shouldn't do. So don't try and grow them on top of a radiator. I know a lot of us have radiator heat in Duluth with these old houses. I have radiators, and they're usually next to windows, so it's really tempting to put them on the radiator, but they dry out too quickly. You just can't keep up with it. So don't put it on top of a radiator. If that's like the only place that you have, put like wood or some other insulative. There's like that reflective bubble wrap type stuff you could put over. You just don't want the heat to be directed at the trays. Look out for where, if you have a forced air heat, look out for where your vents are. You don't want it blowing on the plants, because then they're like warming up a lot and have a lot of airflow, and then they get nothing. So not only is air flowing over them, like during when you're trying to keep them moist, they're also fluctuating in temperature in a way that doesn't make sense for like what is happening with the daylight outside. You can also, though, once they pop, if you feel comfortable, like you're on top of the watering, it's really nice to put a fan near them to kind of increase the ventilation, and also strengthens the stems, because if they're moving in the wind a little bit, they start growing stronger, and that'll help them when you harden them off outside, which if you don't know what that is, we'll go over that too, and then also help them be stronger when you transplant them outside. That'll also help with any mold issues or overwatering issues that you're going. So away from any direct heat sources, and a fan for ventilation can help you. And like if you're an overwaterer or an underwaterer, like at home, if all your plants are dead because you don't water them ever, like maybe take that into account. Or if you're like the kind of person that really hovers and gets too worried and maybe overwaters, you can take that into account too. I brought this in. Raise your hand if you've ever used a germination mat or like a seed mat. Okay. I wouldn't recommend it. I definitely wouldn't recommend it for beginners. I don't know if I even recommend it for experienced people, unless you know exactly what you're wanting to do and why you're doing it. It's basically like a heat pad. If no one uses them or has them or plans on using them, I don't know if I need to waste breath talking about it, but
I bought one, but I haven't used it yet.
yeah, I'd say keep it as simple as possible until you've figured out how to grow without them. But mostly I've seen these cook seeds. So I have a friend who owns a farm here. She uses them because she grows in a basement and there's no natural light, and it's a cold basement, so she kind of needs to. But it's helping her clean up her basement, and there was like a dozen trays that were just scorched. All the seeds were scorched in circle, and the only ones that survived were like on the edges. They're just so hot. If you do use them, put an insulative layer between this and the tray, so like some popsicle sticks or like a blanket or something so that the seeds aren't receiving direct heat from the tray. Also, there's something in plant hormones that tells them to grow when there's fluctuations in temperature and light. So if you have lights and heat on them 24/7, they'll actually be sicker than if you turned off the lights and heat for the nighttime. It's something about their hormones like tells them, oh, I'm growing now, and now I'm whatever. I don't know exactly how it works, but you want to mimic as much as you can, and this goes for if you have supplemental lights as well, mimic as much as you can what's going on outside. So don't try and like grow them from midnight to, or have your lights on from midnight to 6 in the morning or something. Always supplement and or mimic what's going on outside. Do any of you guys plan on using grow lights, or do you have grow lights? Okay.
Used to get.
Do you use them already, the grow lights, or you?
For starting seeds.
Okay. Do you do them in front of a window and use the lights as supplemental, or are you growing in?
Not very powerful lights.
Okay.
For small plots.
Okay. From what I read and what I've done in the past, besides this exceptional case of this farmer who's growing microgreens in her basement, you would almost never need lights that are powerful enough by themselves to grow your seedlings. They're always extra to supplement what's going on in your natural lighting situation. I can grow seeds in a southern window, that's where these will go, with really good success. Towards the end, they start to get a little bit leggy, which means, do you guys know what I mean when I say leggy? So if a plant has inadequate light and it's reaching for the light, it basically stretches itself out until it's like spindly, like spaghetti, and it's almost a lost cause then at that point if you have a very long spindly spaghetti plant. So if you're noticing that happen, you can always start over, and that means that you need some supplemental light, or you've been having a lot of cloudy days. How I get around that is the fan on the plants can help strengthen the stems. You can rotate so that they're not always reaching in the same direction, although sometimes I notice when I'm rotating the trays and they'll reach further the other way and they'll actually get leggier. So that's up to you to try. If you do use the heat mat, you basically can't also have it experiencing direct sunlight. It gets too hot. So it's another reason I almost just say, like, don't worry about the heat mat at all. If your seeds aren't germinating, it's likely not because you don't have a heat mat, if that makes sense. It's probably something else. Besides, like, trying to figure out this lighting situation, lights are just really expensive. They're a huge obstacle, and it's hard to know what bulb to buy. It's hard to know, especially when you're a beginner, what exactly your setup should look like. So I almost encourage you to just go the most simple route you possibly can. See what comes up and see what it looks like, and then go from there. Like, you're not gonna, when you come away from this class, I hope your seedlings turn out. If they don't, I hope that you can start to classify, oh, there was mold, so I overwatered, they were leggy, so I didn't have enough light, and some of these other super common issues, or it didn't germinate at all, maybe my seed was too old, or I didn't plant enough seeds in there. Or I left for 3 days and it died. Does anyone have questions about the light or heat aspects of what your seed needs? Yeah.
So I have like a 3-season porch that is all windows.
Yeah.
And of course there's days even like soonish where it gets nice and warm out there.
Yeah.
So I want to put my plants out there, but then of course at night I cold, so I wanna bring them in,
Yeah.
but is that,
So while they're germinating,
yeah,
the soil temperature does have to stay over a certain temperature in order for them to germinate. But then after that, they'd be okay experiencing as long as a colder night, but not below freezing. If that
Okay.
makes sense. So like, I might, some people actually, light isn't a requirement for germination for a lot of species. Some people actually stack, like this microgreen farmer stacks all of her trays and puts them in a fridge with a crock pot in it. The fridge is off, the crock pot's running, and it's like kind of warm, like maybe like 70, 75 in there, warm and wet, and the trays are all stacked. And so like the moment of germination, she pulls them out and then they get sunlight and all that. So it's not, you might not even need to put them in the sunroom for their germination part, if that makes sense.
okay.
But then once they pop and there's plenty of sunlight out there, then you could bring them out. Yeah. I don't want to get too technical. Like plants want to grow. Like you're just trying to learn what they want to get them to grow. They have it in them. They're built to do that. So we're just trying to unlock their secrets and yeah, help them out a little bit. So let's talk when they're ready. When they're ready to be upplanted is the first true leaf stage. So we talked about the cotyledons, those are the first two that come up. And they usually look the same in a lot of plants. They're not really, you can't differentiate like a basil plant from a tomato plant from a collard plant because they're just these dinky little circular leaves, the first two that come up. The next set that comes up is called the first true leaf stage. So for tomatoes, it would be those like the feathery 3-leaf one. The basil would be like a nice crinkly circular basil leaf, and you'd be like, oh yeah, okay, that's that plant. That's the first true leaf stage. And that's when they're able to be upplanted. So I wouldn't plant them outside at that stage. That's the stage that if you're doing tomatoes and they want to be moved to a bigger pot, that's when you do that. Or if you did one of those big trays and did, like if you sprinkled a lot of seeds in there, then you would move them to a bigger pot at that stage. They're ready to go outside. You have to wait until after the frost date for most of these. You might be able to sneak the cabbage family ones in earlier, or spinach would be okay. But like basil is a heat-loving crop, you wouldn't want to try and sneak that one in earlier. You want to wait till after the frost date. And then maybe you can't fully plant them outside, but you can kind of prep them by doing something called hardening off. So like, let's say you have your basil plant, it's a week before the last frost date, Memorial Day, and it's 65 during the day and sunny. So you put your basil plants out for a couple hours during the day, and then bring them in, and then put them out the next day for maybe a few more hours, and then bring them in. And I actually don't like to do this hardening off process on really hot, sunny days because it actually shocks the plants a little bit more than helps harden them off. They can get sun scald when the sun, if they've experienced like indirect light their whole lives. If they experience direct sunlight on their leaves for the first time and you leave them out all day long, it can really stress them out, and then they're unhealthier for when you plant them outside. So I like to put them out on cloudy days with like light wind. You definitely don't want to do like a hard wind day. It might snap their stems, and you'll notice them getting stronger and becoming more robust as you do that. So you want to plan for usually about at least a week of hardening off before you plant outside to get them used to it. And I also like to transplant outside on cloudy days. I find that, like I said, even for hardening off, it the plants just seem less stressed. They're evaporating less. They're not trying to do photosynthesis while you're moving homes. And there's some plants, like I said, tomatoes that you can bury up to a third. All of these collard greens can be buried a little bit, but you don't want to do too much. I usually go up to like where the cotyledons were on these types of plants. And like pollinator plants, like brown-eyed Susans, go right at the crown. So sometimes it'll say on the back of the packet, the transplanting instructions, like bury up to a third if it's tomatoes. But I'd say general rule of thumb, try to keep it at the level of your original, keep it at the original surface level of your soil, plus like a little bit extra. And just to sort of, tuck it into bed and keep it snug. You want to make sure that you have good like root to earth contact. So if you dug a big hole and you plopped it in and didn't fully tuck the dirt in around the roots, then it's air pruning. Like the roots can't penetrate through air to get to more soil. So you have to make sure that you have soil to root contact. And that goes for if you're direct seeding seeds as well. If there's not enough soil contact on the seed, they won't germinate. So that's why we tuck them in gently here too when we plant our seeds. Yeah. I see pensive faces. Is there any questions, or are you just like daydreaming about like when you're gonna be transplanting these outside now in the garden?
Too hot with indirect heat. We have a 3-season porch too, and it gets pretty toasty in there.
Yeah.
But it's shaded relatively well.
Most plants go into like a stress response. Well, it depends on the crop. Like cool season crops like brassica, spinach, and lettuces, if it was over 85 or 90, they might start getting stressed. Tomatoes like love up to like over 100, they do okay. And so it really depends on what crop you have out there. But if they're spring, like cool season crops and it's getting up to like 90 in there, I'd take them out probably, or open a window or something, and you'll be able to notice if they are stressed out, probably. When I say stressed out, I'm going to try and stay away from this intuitive stuff because you guys might not know what I mean. When I say a plant is stressed out, I'd say there's like maybe yellowing or wilting or drooping, or like it's maybe changed color a little bit. Like instead of, when you steam like beans or broccoli and it's like a bright green color, it looks really healthy. Maybe it's like a dull green. You want to watch out for discoloration, dropping of leaves. If it looks like it's been like in the Arizona, like a leathery old person in Arizona for the last 30 years or something. Do you know what I mean? Like parched, I guess. Thirsty. Would you know a thirsty plant if you saw one? Do you think? Yeah? No. I'm just crazy. Okay. Let's put another question so I can stop rambling. Fertilizer, yeah, we haven't talked soil. So a good time to add fertilizers in the spring, once the soil melts. That'll give you time to work it in. It's always, no matter what you're growing, you can always add more compost. That being said, if you're trying to grow tomatoes, you want to stay away, and other fruiting varieties, you want to stay away from compost that's really high in nitrogen. So you want to stay away from like poultry manure, which has the highest concentrations of nitrogen in it. And the reason being, the plants, when plants get excess amounts of nitrogen, they focus on foliar growth, so they focus on putting out leaves rather than fruiting. So if it's early in the season, it can be okay, but if it's into when you are wanting the tomatoes to be producing fruit, you just get a jungle. So if you've ever noticed, you've ever tried to grow tomatoes and there's just a jungle and you can't even see the fruit in there, it's probably an excess of nitrogen. So you could start, for tomatoes specifically as this example, start with some nitrogen fertilizer, like composted turkey manure or something, and then by like July or August, adding blood meal, which is more the nutrients that plants need for that fruiting process. It's very rich in its blood, like it has everything they need to make the fruit. If you notice that the fruit is irregular, like the tomatoes are deformed, or the zucchinis are like coming out double or something, that means a potassium deficiency. And tomatoes actually really like anything that fruits needs potassium in order to fruit correctly. So that could be potash or like hardwood ashes. So potash are like these little red rocks that you can get at like Dan's feed bin, like there's a bulk bin. It's just an amendment that you can add to your soil. Yeah.
So you're saying amend the soil before transplanting, not mix it with like a water and make it tea, or and then there's nitrogen, potassium,
NPK. Yeah, those are the three main nutrients that plants need, is N, nitrogen, P, phosphorus, and then K is potassium. So those are the big three that you're looking to fill. Potassium deficiency, like I said, looks like irregular fruiting. It can also look like the plant is unable to pull water up and or nutrients up and down its stem, so the stem might be like weak or floppy or discolored. Phosphorus is, why is phosphorus important? I don't remember right now. Nitrogen's important for foliar growth, basically. So that's why farmers are really fixated on nitrogen, and phosphorus too, actually, all of those. Potassium can be found naturally in hardwood ash. There does exist in softwood ash, so like if you have a sauna and you burn like fir trees or something in it, you could still use those, but it has like 30% of the potassium that a hardwood does. Phosphorus is found naturally in urine. I wouldn't recommend that. You can actually burn plants by applying any of these directly to the plant itself. So when you're asking about working it in ahead of time or applying it as a tea to the plant, as long as you aren't applying it directly so it's not touching the plant. So like if you have like I use a sustain, which is like a composted turkey manure at my garden, and I'll like sprinkle a donut. If I want to amend during the season itself, I'll sprinkle like a donut around my plant, and I'll make a little trench so that it's not touching the stem, because you can actually get nitrogen burn if it's right up against the plant. In a similar way, I'd assume that if you were doing a tea, don't do a foliar one. It depends on the tea. Like if it was a worm castings tea, it would probably be fine. But if it's like a nitrogen tea, I probably wouldn't. put it on the foliage. I don't know, it depends. But if you're gardening and you're worried about your soil health, or really just in general, if you're, it's just always a good idea to get a soil test. The U of M, the last time I checked, I think it was $17 to send in a soil sample to the U of M extension, and the instructions are all online. It's super easy and simple. You would just take, like, let's say you had a 20 by 20 foot garden. You'd go take, you want to get all the duff off, like all the old grass or anything that's there, leaf litter, get to the surface level of the soil, and then go down. I think it's maybe 6 inches to get a core. And then you want to do that in at least like 2 other places so that it's not just that one spot, if it's a misrepresentation of your soil in that one spot. So you want to get multiple samples in your garden. And they test for NPK, they also test for organic matter, and then you can get add-ons, pay like an extra fee for lead, and also salt. So if you're next to a road where they push up the snowbanks in the winter and then it melts into your garden, or if you're next to a road that's been a road for more than 40 or 50 years when we still had leaded gasoline, there could be lead in your soil. So if you're concerned about that or want to know what your levels are at, get a soil test. That's always the first step when you're talking amendments for garden beds. Unless you know that you're going to bring in your own soil, then it's a moot point. There's been some gardens where I don't want to deal with clay or rocks or salt, and so I just cardboard the whole thing and then bring in a garden mix from a local dirt company. And the garden mix is usually like 20% compost and then like 80% topsoil or black dirt or something, and they mix it for you and then dump it. So you can always start from scratch if you find that you have like too high of lead levels, or or if the amendments are just going to be too much to handle. You can always bring in your own soil. But that's why compost is a good all-around amendment to add, because it has a little bit of everything and it has organic matter, which is important too. Organic matter is especially important for where we live in Duluth, because we have really clay-heavy soils, and clay doesn't hold water and it keeps water where it is. So what organic matter does is it helps hold water in the soil. So over time, if you're continually adding organic matter in and working it in, you can get better soil for growing the longer you tend to the soil. But the first step is always the soil test. If you're wanting, like let's say your test comes back and it's 1 part per million nitrogen, which happened to me at my farm, because it was a hay field for about 20 years before I farmed it, and so they were taking the hay and then bringing it off-site and feeding it to livestock, and nothing was being put back into the land. So we got I think it was like, when you're buying fertilizers and when you're buying compost, sometimes there'll be 3 numbers. Like it'll be like 8, 8, 8. And that basically means that the ratios of N, P, and K are all the same. So for our farm, we bought something that was like 20, 5, 5. So the nitrogen was 20, the highest ratio, and then lower ratios of P and K. And yeah, like I said before, if you do get your soil test back and find out that there's certain things that you're very deficient in, there is natural options for each of those minerals, or whatever you want to call them, elements. And there is like really easy solutions too that are industrialized, like the little red rocks of potash that you can get at Dan's feed bin. And yeah, as a general rule of thumb, once the plants are in the ground, you don't ever want to have your amendments directly touching the plants. So that's what's called a side dressing technique, where let's say you put a donut around your tomato plant and then you sprinkle a trench around and you sprinkle your amendments, and then you should also kind of lightly cover them as well. So that'll keep them from splashing up back onto the plant, from washing away, and will help them trickle down slowly where the plant needs them into the roots.
Should that be like the tree at the drip line?
Say that again?
How big should the donut be?
So the plant's roots only reach usually as far as the leaves go, so it should be within the understory of the leaves in order for it to reach the roots. Sometimes, if I have like a really long row of plants, I'll just take my hoe and do like one long line all down, like maybe 3 or 4 inches away from the base of the plant, and then sprinkle all the amendments in there and then rake it over. So it could be a donut, it could be a line right next to the base of the plant, or you work it in before you plant your plants. So as soon as you can get into the garden when things melt, you would add your blood meal or your composted manure or whatever. In this case, hopefully you would have done your soil test already and you know exactly what you need to add, and then you work it in. And the downside to that is if it's an expensive fertilizer or an expensive amendment, you do lose a little because you're not going to plant plants in every single square, like it's not going to be used by all the plants, right? You're going to lose some amendment, but if you're on top of your game, that's almost the method that I prefer, because it's worked in. You don't have to worry about it burning them or washing away or getting splashed up or like animals finding it or children, animals being attracted. Sometimes they're attracted to the blood meal, or children finding it and eating it or something. So I prefer to work it in before things are planted. And then if things are very heavy feeders and I notice that they're not doing so well, then I'll add some mid-season. But I actually, when I did do that, the last 2 years I found that it was actually clubroot was why my plants were looking stunted and unhealthy. It wasn't a lack of fertilizer. So sometimes the problem is not what you think it is either.
So, sorry for all the questions.
No, it's
but,
good.
Are you spacing your garden like the high nitrogen plants on one side and then the high potassium ones? Like, is that level of planting necessary, or is this kind of too nerdy about it?
No, I plant by plant families for crop rotation. So, and if it's in the same plant family, it probably works too for what type of feeder it is, because they're probably similar requirements. So I'll plant all my cabbage crops in one bed, all my nightshades in another bed. There's a lot of nightshades. Potatoes are nightshades, eggplant, tomatoes, peppers are all nightshades. And then cucurbits or the squash family in another section, legumes in another section. So I'll try and move them around each year. That helps especially if you're doing it on a larger scale. Pests will go to a certain plant family and feed off it year after year if you plant it in the same area. So you're trying to confuse them by moving it. However, I'm in a 20 by 20 foot community gardens plot, and on that small of a scale, I don't think it matters very much to move, for the insects at least, like 2 feet across an aisle. It might make a difference with diseases that are in the soil though. So that's part of like fall cleanup in your garden too. You want to make sure that you're not leaving like a bunch of old rotten tomatoes in your bed or like old squashes, because there's like squash bugs that could have laid their eggs in there and they'll grow up and pupate in the spring and then start eating your squash plants. So crop rotation, if you're growing on a larger scale, is really important. And just like good to practice too if you're on a smaller scale as well. Yeah.
When should we start our seeds?
So you want to work backwards from the last frost date, and we decided that mid-April would be 6 weeks from the last frost date. So you still have like a week to decide what you want to start. Yeah.
A friend said something today about wait until the snow is gone and then start plants. And we have a lot of snow on the ground, so it's going to be cold and it's going to be pretty wet.
Yeah, that's the trouble with those phenological like folklore sayings is in this time of like global weirding, weather weirding. I don't know if we can follow those phenological indicators anymore because the plants are confused. And we broke records for snow this year, so I don't know if they might not be started till like June if we said wait to start your seeds until there's no more snow. But it might be 60s or 70s this weekend, so maybe it'll go away. But no, I'd go for the timing. The 4 to 6 weeks from the last frost date is usually when you start seeds indoors. Yeah.